There is no gatekeeping here. This is not a closed practice. This is a very welcoming practice. I'm not going to police anybody's doing Brujeria de Rancho. I think, the spirits do their job beautifully.
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. Today, we're so excited to dive deep into the tradition of Mexican sorcery with Laura Davila, a.k.a. Daphne La Hechicera. So, what exactly is Mexican sorcery? What does it mean to be a bruja de rancho, or a witch of the ranch? And what are these magical practices associated with the Brujeria de Rancho tradition? How are the practices of full Catholicism related to being a bruja and the practice of hechicera, or sorcery? Well, Laura Davila, a.k.a. Daphne La Hechicera, is the perfect person to ask. Laura is a fifth-generation Mexican witch, a longtime practitioner of brujeria, hechicera, and full Catholicism. Laura learned her magical practice at her grandmother's knees. Born and raised in Mexico, Laura has lived in the United States since about 2010. She's a tarot card reader, a flower essence practitioner, and also the author of the excellent book from Red Wheel Weiser Books called Mexican Sorcery, a practical guide to Brujeria de Rancho, which covers topics like spell work, cleansings, herbs, talismans, how to protect against the evil eye, and also how to cast, break, and avert hexes and curses. Also, a huge thanks to each and every Glitch Bottle patron on Patreon for your excellent questions for Laura and for your amazing support. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, let's welcome Laura Davila, a.k.a. Daphne La Hechicera. Laura Davila, a.k.a. Daphne La Hechicera, thank you so much just for taking some time and stopping on the Glitch Bottle podcast today.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be with you guys today and have this talk.
Laura, the honor is mine because I remember first discussing your work on the podcast with the great Ed Calderon when talking about the Santa Muerte tradition, and I'm equally so excited to be diving into this tradition of Mexican sorcery with you and the tradition of the Brujeria de Rancho. And I think, Laura, the best place to start might be with you learning this tradition at your grandmother's knees. Can you just tell us about what you learned from your grandmother and just growing up being a fifth generation Mexican witch?
I was lucky enough to met my great-grandmother. I was always very lucky because I had pretty much all my grandparents around. Sometimes there is people who doesn't get to know their grandparents, but I got to know my great-grandparents and two of my great-great-grandmothers. So, we started having kids really young. That's why I think that was an advantage. And at the same time, it was a con, especially for the women in my family, right? My grandma, Diana's side, used to, when she was alive, made her living doing workings, doing spiritual workings like amares and endulzamientos and limpias. And in the other hand, my other grandmother never called herself like a bruja, but when she was like pretty mad, she used to call herself like that, but she never made money with that. It was more for herself and people she loved and she protected when she was alive. So I got to learn the two sides of Brujeria de Rancho, which one is very mystical, I will say, and the other one is more like hands-on. And I was lucky too because my grandma, Diana, married a brujo who was a Rosicrucian too. So he was more like into tarot and to Rosicrucian magic, and he was in a logia. So I had a lot of, different aspects of Mexican magic because, La Orden de la Rosacruz is very, very traditional in Mexico. People doesn't realize that, but we have like long time of with logias like masonería, like con los de la logia de la Rosa Cruz. Entonces, so I had all these aspects of magic combined together because everybody in my family was doing something different, right? But at the same time, they were doing the same, but in different ways. So that's how I learned from them, from all of them. Like from some of them was more like in the ensalmeria because my great grandma used to be an ensalmadora, and an ensalmador is somebody who heals and cures with through like prayers and like tinctures with alcohol or alcoholados. That's how we call it in Spanish. And my other grandma, it was more about the amares and protections. And my other grandma it was more like in the folk Catholic side. And at the same time, she was very Catholic. She used to belong to a cofradia where people like praise for the animas and the purgatory. So all those elements like help me to understand like different kinds of magic.
When you were young, were you brought into or invited by your grandmothers to participate in specific things? Or was it just kind of observing on the outside? Or how did you begin to learn this?
Well, they never like hid their practices from us at all. I mean, I knew like what they were doing, but they never actually like sit here and I'm going to teach you. It was something very casual, just like I put this example a lot. Even I mention it on my book, like how somebody will learn their mother tongue. You don't sit down with dad or mom and, hey, you need to learn how to say this or that, or it's very rare. You just start learning like a correspondence and, like a planet or a teaching, a versicle in the Bible or a card on the tarot. I remember it was very funny because I started learning how to read tarot when I was 7, and it was totally out of like my grandpa just forgot my birthday. So I went there and I was like, Grandpa, it's my birthday. And he was like, you know what? I'm going to give you, he was about to discard one tarot deck that was very old. So every Sunday he used to give me 3 cards, and it was very like PG-13, even though I was 7. You're going to learn these correspondences and you're going to learn these 3 cards. And when you learn these 3 cards, I'm going to give you another 3. But it was totally because he just like didn't remember my birthday. It wasn't something that they were planning to teach me. For them, especially my grandma Diana and my grandpa Raul, it was a way to make their living because that's the only thing that they knew how to do. In comparison, like my grandma Socorro and my grandpa Marcelino, they had a farm and they were working the land and they had ganado. They were raising cattle. But in my mom's side, it was 100% to make a living.
There's this entire tradition, starting in Mexico and then in the United States on the Brujeria de Rancho. Can you just give us some background on where did this tradition, the Brujeria de Rancho, where did that start? What were the origins of this tradition?
Well, the Brujeria de Rancho, just like it started like very folklorically. It's even like songs, corridos about La Bruja de Rancho. It started as stories that our grandparents used to tell us about brujas who were shapeshifters, nahuales, and they used to transform in different animals. But these brujas, there is actually museums in these ranchos. Like if you go, you can take a tour, for example, to La Petaca, Nuevo León, and you go and see the pictures of these brujas and these curanderas, because all of them used to do brujeria, hechiceria, ensalmeria, curanderismo, but some of them were like more like specialized in one thing. You know what I'm saying? So you go to La Petaca, Nuevo León, and there is like tours where you get in the bus in the city and you drive 2 hours and you can see these pictures of these brujas, how they used to like cure people, who were them, what songs they were like made for them, because they were very miraculous to the point like people was like making songs for them. Or even if you want to go, I don't know if you're familiar with El Niño Fidencio or El Fidencismo, it's in the same state. Instead of going to La Petaca, you want to go, for example, to El Espinazo, Nuevo León. You take a bus and there is a museum. There is La Iglesia Fidencista, so that's how it started. We can be said that this started, I don't know, 200 years ago, but it started like very, very famous in the 30s with even presidents in Mexico, like El Presidente Calles and Adolfo Ruiz Cortines started to visiting these places to get healed or to get power, or to get in la silla presidencial, like the presidential chair. So that's how this started, like in the ranchos, in the rural communities, in the states of Nuevo León, Coahuila, and all the northeastern side of Mexico. You can hear these stories. You can go to these witch towns. That's how we call them. To La Petaca, to El Espinazo, Nuevo León, to Arteaga, Coahuila. We have another one in La Biznaga. If you Google right now, Las Brujas de la Biznaga, you will find a lot of information too. So it's specifically in one area of Mexico. I wouldn't say every Mexico has or follows this practice, but it's very, very traditional and very belonging from the place that I was born and raised in that part of Mexico. So that's pretty much how that started.
Wow, that's incredible. I as someone who grew up Catholic myself, I remember going into church at a young age, and you'd see icons and pictures of the saints on the walls. But to hear you share about, you can go to certain places and see pictures of the practitioners, of the brujos.
Oh, yeah.
The brujas.
Yeah, I can send you even the videos of, people who has taken these videos and pictures of these tours where they go and see who was practicing there and who started. It's really awesome. I'm very proud to be the one who brought this to the United States, because a lot of people think I make it up or I invented it or I founded this. I just feel like I just bring it here to the United States. I just dust it off and, rescue it for everybody to understand, that to learn, to appreciate. But it's not something that belongs to me, or that I create or my grandparents. It has years, centuries working this way in these specifically rural communities.
Something, if my memory serves, that Ed Calderon mentioned about you was that exactly you are so vital because you are preserving this living tradition and also sharing it with new people who are interested to become practitioners or to learn more about it. And so before we get to the specifics of the book, what inspired you to write this book, Mexican Sorcery, A Practical Guide to Brujeria de Rancho? Was there one reason? Was it this is part of preserving the tradition?
It was part of that, but at the same time, I feel it was a gap in the community, especially in the Mexican American community, where it was a lot of gatekeeping, something that I don't know why they were gatekeeping. I was very you know what, this cannot continue like that, because at some point it's going to be my children's the one that are going to be gatekeeped from their own traditions because they were born here or because they don't speak Spanish. So for me, it was a way to preserve this, not only for my kids, for my grandkids and my great-grandkids, because it was a lot of people making stuff up we're the traditional Mexican brujeria and we only know how, that's how it's done. And I was okay, in what part of Mexico? Because to talk about traditional Mexican brujeria will be pretty much talking about pozole. When you say pozole, maybe somebody is going to imagine the traditional pozole is a red pozole with the hominy and stuff. But if you go to Mexico and you go to different parts of Mexico, you're going to get served a different pozole. It could be white, it could be green, it could be black, or it could be red. That doesn't mean it's less traditional than the red one. It's going to be a different meat in all of them. The green has chicken meat mixed with pork meat, and the red one has pork meat. And the white one has pancita, has the stomach. but all of them are pozole. Another thing that I was seeing a lot, I remember that Ed mentioned, it was people taking off the elements of all Catholicism, which is something like, it's just like wrong in so many levels, because it's like taking the hominy from the pozole. Okay, you want to take it off because you don't like it, but don't call it pozole. It's a caldo. It was different reasons like these that made me say, hey, this is not something that we should approach like this, because it's not like our ancestry. Our ancestors will have liked, because our ancestors were very, very welcoming and sharing people. Our ancestors taught us things like, mi casa es su casa. Do I serve you a plate? So for me, like these things like, oh, this only can be practiced by some, when the Mexican ancestry is so vast of different cultures that none of them is close to anybody. Why this will be close? So for me, it was a way to preserve, to share, and at the same time, like honor our ancestry, honor these spirits that have helped us all along the way, honor our grandmothers that a lot of them immigrated to the United States, and they were not as lucky as I am right now, where I was 7 years here in the United States undocumented. You know, I finally fixed my immigration status. I'm able to publish a book without the fear like I'm going to get deported. They didn't have that luck. A lot of them had to work 2 or 3 jobs. I don't. So for me, it was a way to honor a lot of grandmothers who came here to offer a better life for their children. And they were silent in different ways, economically, politically. You know, they had a language barrier that I have a really thick accent, but I cannot imagine like for what was for them. So it was a lot of reasons why I decided to write Mexican Sorcery. It wasn't easy because English is not my first language. But at the same time, it was a way to preserve for a lot of Mexican people too, because just like Ed said, the majority of brujas de rancho who are still in La Petaca, en La Biznaga, en Mina, ahí en El Espinazo, Nuevo León, they're in their 70s, you know, like my grandma were. So for me, it's a way to continue this for the posterity and offer this in a really traditional way to our descendants.
To touch on your exact point, something that you brought up, I know Ed Calderon brought up, is this element, as you said, of folk Catholicism. And you touch on this in the book a lot, which I really love. And to that point, we have a listener question for you, Laura, from Justin Walker, who is a Glitch Bottle patron. And Justin is asking, can you, Laura, comment on the role that Catholic saints have in the traditional brujeria culture in Mexico?
I mentioned it in, I think it's the 8th chapter that is working with the saints. These saints that we work with in Brujeria de Rancho usually are saints who have already proved their healing and protection powers to the most like beaded sectors of the Mexican population, right? A lot of these saints have or had, when they were alive, different characteristics. Some of them like San Cipriano, or some of them like Santa Rita de Casia, or other saints had like very dark aspects in their personality or how they were before becoming saints. So we work with these like nuances of their faith or how people live their faith through these saints. So I think we work very, very close with these saints, and not only saints that they had been like recognized for the Catholic Church, but we work a lot with folk saints too, that they were not still like recognized for within the Catholic Church as saints. So they play a really important role on what Brujeria de Rancho practices.
You also give procedures for working with prayer cards, Saint Expedite to overcome addiction. I mean, there's so many things that you can do with saints. It's gigantic almost.
Yeah, because everybody thinks, well, that's another misconception that I have seen here in the United States. Like saints, you can only work with saints in candles or lighting candles, but we work with them on prayer cards, There is like a spell that I mentioned there for economic violence. For the woman, like you enchant a card so you get your child support for your children, or you are not violented economically, by your partner. Or sometimes you can work with these prayer cards, as a way to give testimony. Like I mentioned in the book, there is a saying that is very requested for drug addiction or alcoholism in Mexico, who is San Expedite, that it was taken by the AA community because of the slogan "Solo por hoy," just for today. And we know San Expedite is totally against procrastination. That's how, people started working with him over there. And there is a spell for that. And I think I mentioned to San Pancras, that is for shop owners. Everybody tell me, I feel the one that it was more featured on the book is San Martin Caballero, San Martin of Tours. And it is because if you go to these ranchos, you're always going to see every bruja over there working with San Martin of Tours. I share more in the next chapter that he also has a darker aspect. He is considered in a lot of indigenous cultures in Mexico that he's el Charro Negro. So there is pretty much a saint for everything and everyone in the book.
Your book does such a great job of connecting all the dots, showing how there's this kind of holistic tradition. Can you talk about the practical nature and just how this is meant to be used and to be worked?
Remember, the northeastern part of Mexico is pretty much the ecosystem, the flora, the fauna. It's a desert. You don't have a lot of plants. It's rare. Even where you have a lot of mountains, these mountains are like the mountains you will have pretty much in Arizona. So what we lack in ingredients, we have in creativity. We balance it with how we're going to do this without that. So we have a lot of experience on that. And that's how, a lot of things in the book, 98% of the times you're not going to have to go to a botanica. You don't have to go to any place or order things online. Pretty much everything what, I recommend for the spells and the workings, you have it in your house, or you can get it at the supermarket, or it's already in your pantry. Or even if you are right now or facing a really economical hardship, you can even ask to your neighbor and they will not even know you want it for brujeria, like cinnamon, cumin, salt, anything. So that was another fear that I had when I was doing the book. I know my sales are going to rely a lot on shops and botanicas carrying it. And I was they're going to hate me. Because I'm you don't need anything, and usually a lot of magical books, you take a book and a lot of people go to the botanicas or these esoteric shops and it's they have a list. So what kind of business they're going to have with me? And no, I'm so lucky and so happy that a lot of botanicas and esoterical shops are carrying it, and they're, oh my God, I'm so happy that you wrote this. And I'm oh, wow. I'm so happy that they like it, because it's not something that they will get a lot of business of, Totally the opposite. They will oh, okay, so I don't need to spend a lot of money, or I don't need to buy crystals. So for me, it was to put out there what really is in the practice of Las Brujas de Rancho. They lack a lot of ingredients. They lack a lot of resources to purchase things like that. And a lot of it is because, the ecosystem doesn't allow that. And the other one is because they know they don't need that in order to accomplish what they need to accomplish.
Yeah, it gives you the strong reminder and impression of the power in your book of working with your environment. I mean, here on page 126, you have in your book and Salamo to get rid of bad shadows. And the ingredients that you say you need are sotol or any alcohol, bay leaf, rosemary, 3 cloves, or a metal or glass bottle. And so, yeah, like these are ingredients that most people, could maybe just find at their local supermarket or something like that.
Absolutely. That was like one of my fears, but I'm realizing people is like, wow, it is just so simple. And I'm like, yeah, that's how it was done. And it is, and it's going to be, because that's how it works. And I think we're like in a point where I know like you're pretty much of my same age, and a lot of people of my same age is like, but how, these kids are ending up with a lot of crystals and cosplays. And I'm like, it was Pinterest. Pinterest is to blame. We were more about books, and that was it. We need to get back to that 80s and 90s folk magic practices where we pretty much needed like anything but the minimal.
I think this is a great time, Laura, to discuss a topic that I know you discuss a lot in the book, which is the concept of a pact, an agreement with spirits. I believe this is chapter 9. Can you just share about what is a pact in the Brujeria tradition? How does it work? I mean, what are the basics about that?
That's another thing that I wrote because, I have seen a lot of, different books in Brujeria Mexicana wrote in English where you need a lot of things to make the pact and a lot of inks. And I think that's not something that we were doing in Mexico at any point. And I'm going to tell you why. Because when the colonization happened, or first ancestors, or Native American or Native Mexican ancestors had their own ways to work their spiritual matters, right? But when people move to Mexico and colonize Mexico, I'm not only talking about the Spaniards, I'm talking about the Sephardic Jewish and a lot of people with African ancestry were in Mexico. We had a really, really marked persecution by the Holy Inquisition. They were not actually like looking for brujas as in other places. They were looking for Sephardic Jewish that they supposedly like converted, but they actually didn't. So all these practices that they were related to brujeria or hechiceria in Spain or Africa, they had to be hidden because everybody was like looking for somebody to blame. So you pretty much were not able to even write your own pacts. So these pacts were usually made orally through conjures and prayers, and they were like passed on as popular knowledge from one generation to another. So that's why when I see like pacts on Mexican brujeria with inks and blood and paper and a lot of these things that I'm like, how? That's something that you're mixing with other traditions because we just learned these things and we did an offering, we leave it somewhere, but if somebody was passing by, you didn't have anything with you. But what you had in your knowledge, in your mind, that they were not able to prove you anything, So usually these pacts are made in certain times of the day, in certain days, making certain offerings, but they're mostly oral.
And you say in the book as well, Laura, that Tuesdays and Fridays at midnight are very, Can you share a little bit more about the timing?
These days were like always like used for brujeria still today because they're hot days. We use a lot of the hot-cold polarity. So when we need something like a pact, we use the Tuesdays and Fridays. Actually, when we do Limpias, that's the same days that we use. Another spirit that I talk a lot in the Pacts is el Charro Negro. El Charro Negro is a character of our folklore that has different stories too, depending on the part of Mexico that you go. Some people says that is not actually the devil, or Satan is actually like a servant, which is the one that is more like among people, the version that is more among people. In a lot of people in indigenous communities of Mexico, they say is Martir Caballero, but in the nights, or like a sinister version of him. Other people in northern Rancho says is the anima of Agapito Treviño, who you can even listen to corridos. And he was like the Robin Hood of Monterrey. He used to like rob the rich and give that money to the poor, but he was captured and he was executed. Everybody says Del Charro Negro is actually the anima or the spirit of Agapito Treviño, like coming to you. But yeah, it's different versions, and most of our abuelas, when they needed something like really, really bad, they used to call upon the Charro Negro to bail them out with money, with something. So that's why I added him, because I don't know if you notice, I think it's like 5 different workings with San Martín Caballero. So the Charro Negro will be the 6th. I think it's to take away brujeria for sales and different things that we work with San Martín Caballero. But that part of San Martín Caballero, that's when you want something more like mundane, I can say it, you call upon the Charro Negro.
I love that context, Laura, and many of our listeners are familiar in the grimoire tradition with working with various angels. And I know you and I were chatting before the podcast about Samael and Michael. And can you add a little more context with what you say? This is on page 167, but you say in your book, quote, before the power of Saint Michael the Archangel, many devotees prostrated themselves to request his protection from danger, for good health, money, love, and good crops, and protection of their cattle. So can you talk about the relationship between El Charro Negro and the angels, Michael, Samael?
Yeah. Well, San Martín de Tours is a very Martian spirit. He was actually named after Mars, who is the god of war. He was a soldier. He has all these characteristics that they're very Martian. When you're talking about the Charro Negro, who is the sinister side of San Martín of Tours, he keep a lot of these characteristics, but it takes it to another side, which is like very Martian, but in the like darker aspects of Mars. I think they're very alike.
As well, Laura, something you touched on earlier, we have another listener question for you from Justin Walker, who is asking, can you, Laura, comment on the role and function of the La Limpa ritual? My wife's mother is Mexican from a small village outside of Puebla, and she recommends a limpa to my wife many times. Can you share with listeners who maybe this is their first time of hearing about what is the La Limpa ritual?
Well, a limpia is a process ritual where you're going to take out like dirtiness, physical or spiritual, with different things, A limpia impacts really, really positively in our spiritual matter, because if you have something clean, you can like put something else that is good on, that space where something that was rotten or bad or taking space used to be. So these limpias, what I talk about in the book, there is like several methods, like you can use candles, you can use floor washes, you can use saumerios, you can use, depending what you like need to clean or where you need to focus on, that's the type of limpia that you will perform in your house. So yeah, I usually make one limpia that is once a month, like I take everything out of the closets that I don't need and I donate. And I always start with the physical space and then the spiritual one goes next. So yeah, especially if you guys are like doing spiritual work, you need to be constantly focusing on Limpia, because that's the other thing. If you're inviting spirits to your house or like forming a relationship with new spirits, what would you do when you have an invitee to your house, a guest? You want to have your house clean. So you cause a good impression and that spirit is comfortable.
These Limpia rituals are rituals that before people worry about, El Charro Negro and complex spirit pacts and oral conjurations, they should first focus on their own domicile, their own environment and cleansing it. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. Any other spirit doesn't have to be del Charro Negro or el Diablo. Any spirit, I think, and ourselves, I think everybody's more happy, more optimistic, more willing to do things when you have like a clean space to do so. We focus a lot on that.
As well, Laura, in the book, you talk a lot about cursing and hexing and what does it mean to curse someone or something with hexicera. Can you break down the basics for those who might be hearing it for the first time? What does a curse actually mean, or a hex in hexicera?
There is a lot of people, like, I think, has the misconception where there is something wrong, or since you're using like folk Catholicism or like parts of folk Catholicism, you shouldn't be doing that, or you should be like really careful because the karma. But that is something that doesn't even exist in our tradition. Brujeria de Rancho is very primal. It's people who needs to use their cunning and their wits to survive. It's like eat or get eaten by somebody else. So a lot of this hexing and cursing probably will not have moral justification in the 2023 sense, but we have to understand like this practice was created by people who had a lot of disadvantages in life because they didn't have the same level of education or privilege, or that other like groups, that were living maybe in the cities who had more access to things, to education. So that was a way to readdress balance between them and other people. An example today, my kids, they're going to go to college and they only have one scholarship and they know another two kids who are competing with them. Even if the other two kids are not bad kids by any meanings, like in Brujeria de Rancho, you will totally hex those kids to get an advantage or even like be at the same level because, that's what we do.
Can you share more about the role that cursing and hexing plays, for example, for people who cannot pay lawyers' fees if there's some kind of legal thing? Is that a common request? Can you talk about that?
A lot. Well, we have to understand that is a lot of cultural things that they're attached to Mexican people from, I don't know how long, but in Mexico, in still 2023, justice is only for people who can pay for justice. It's not like in the United States, like you most likely, and even here, they have their own like issues, but over there is triple or more, where, somebody has a kid and gets like run over for like a drunk driver, or you have a daughter and she marries somebody and that person commits femicide, or, there is a lot of girls that they're being raped and like kidnapped for cartels too. How do you deal with impunity if you don't have a way to deal with impunity with money because you don't have the means to get served justice? So there is a lot of people who is like, I cannot pay for a lawyer. And even if I was able to pay for a lawyer, the other person maybe has a better lawyer, or that's how we take justice in our own hands and deal with impunity. There is a lot of curses that they're very traditional, where I talk how unalive somebody, or how even like get away with, I talk about the Black el justo juez negro to get away with a crime, but it's totally in the context where somebody kills your children and you make a mess in the other people's house or in their life. Now that I took the justice in my own house, how I do not get punished by it. So there is a lot of that in the book because culturally it's something that we're still enduring and suffering. So it's something that I had to put there because I think that's one of the bases of Brujeria de Rancho. These people were tired of that stuff. So that was still like their way to have a little bit of peace and at the same time, readdress balance in some way.
One of the things I really like about your book too, Laura, is you talk about how people from different traditions can find something in your book to access, to resonate with. And we have a listener question for you from Michelle Rella Summers, a Glitch Bottle patron. And she is asking and saying, "Hi there. How does your tradition relate to hoodoo or voodoo? Thank you. And I look forward to hearing from you."
This practice was created out of lack of resources, lack of justice, lack of means, lack of a lot of things that other privileged groups have, and we didn't. So I think it's a way that it totally relates each other. And at the same time, we had to hide our practices under Catholicism or folk Catholicism. So they're very alike for pretty much the same reasons why they were created in the first place.
We also, Laura, have a listener question for you from Cabra. And Cabra is asking, what kind of plants are local to you, and do any of them factor into your practice?
Well, that's something that I talk about in, I think it's the second chapter. I even mentioned like, wherever the bruja goes, I think the chapter is talk to your plants and seeds. Wherever the bruja goes is going to use their craft. The thing is, a lot of brujos de rancho understand that we had to emigrate in order to pursue our dreams or the love of our life. And not a lot of us like immigrate to the United States. I know people from my hometown who is in Switzerland right now or who is in Denmark. So for me was a way to put, yes, we use a lot of things like Ocolmeca or La Gobernadora or things that grow specifically in El Desierto. But this is an animistic practice. This is a practice that has a backup in the land. Why we're going to, hook our credit cards and maybe destabilize like an ecosystem where we were born just to get something done. So usually I don't use some specific plants that only grows in my hometown, but others like cinnamon, like things that I can get from the grocery store. That's what I use. Because I don't think is something that we should do. Like, first of all, there is a lot of laws and customs and immigration that if you pass with an apple or certain like seeds, you get in jail or you get a fee of $2,000. So once we move to another place, we need to start developing a new relationships. And I think that the book encouraged people to do that with the things that they have on hand. It doesn't matter where they move. So yeah, I have very specific herbs that I only use when I go to visit over there. But I'm not even able, like, legally to bring them here.
Laura, this might be the perfect time to bring up something that you've touched on throughout the interview. And it really talks about the misconceptions, but also the differences between the brujas o brujos in Mexico practicing and the brujas o brujos in the United States. What are some of the big differences? What are some of the things that people do not understand about maybe the different ways and traditions between the United States and Mexico?
Well, that thing, like, I think brujos here throw very loose the word decolonize, very loose. And the funny part is, like, a lot of them are so focused on decolonize their own practice, but they're not so focused on decolonize their own behavior. I was talking with another brujo who is from Venezuela that, especially in Mexico, in Venezuela, in Colombia, in a lot of countries in Latin America has this like publishing issue that piracy, right? And a lot of like Mexican authors, a lot of Venezuelan authors, Colombian authors want to publish their own books about their own practices because most of these people is a communality that they're in rural towns. And a lot of American, even like with ancestry, Mexican or Puerto Rican or Colombian are, asked to publish their books in Spanish instead of giving that opportunity to people born and raised in those countries. So we're like, okay, the colonized. But while you go to vacations to Hawaii, when so many times they have told you that they don't want you there. And at the same time, publish something that is not even in your practice because you're already like mixing with Wicca. We're mixing with other practices in other countries. Another thing like the gatekeeping. Gatekeeping Mexican brujeria from who or for why? You know what I'm saying? When all this practice, for example, Brujeria de Rancho, Brujeria Mexicana traditional is made from a lot of practices and ancestries. They were open to everybody. Why now they're all together in one? You want to make it like I'm not on the idea, especially because people who does this kind of magic is vulnerable, just like immigrants are, just like people from minorities is. So why gatekeeping somebody maybe who have a different language or a different skin color? Put them in a box like, oh, you should only be doing hoodoo or you should only be doing Appalachian, when all of us who have the necessity of folk magic, we're vulnerable in some way. So that's not what we were taught, at least when I was in Mexico. That's not what I was taught. I was taught magic and medicine belongs to everybody. It's not something that we should privatize or monopolize. So that's why it doesn't make sense for me. Like a lot of people, focusing so much on taking the aspects of folk Catholicism to call themselves like they're doing the job. But they're not really doing the job in the things that it really matter. I'm not saying that you should go and kiss the Pope's hand or like you should go every Sunday to church or you shouldn't raise your voice to ask for reparations by any means. If you have read the book, I even said, Brujos de Rancho are totally against this and that and the atrocities that the Catholic Church as an institution has committed, not only in Mexico, but everywhere else in the world. So that's what I think, like people just hear a word that is very catchy in social media and they give it another context that it doesn't really matter. Let's give that context to the things that they're affecting the world, that they're affecting other countries, that they're affecting other people. And instead of just make drama out of nothing, let's unite, let's empower not only as Mexicans, as minorities. Even if you're not in a minority, my husband, my second husband is white and he grew up very poor. He didn't have parents, So let's empower the people who's struggling, It is that. And I think because I have trouble because I say these things out loud. And I always tell them, I trust my spirits and I trust spirits in general. When somebody is not approaching with caution, with respect and love, that's their job. To keep this how it should be and policing and gatekeeping. Let's give the spirit their job that we know they can do. Because you may be gatekeeping somebody who has more right to this tradition than you have. There is some people like maybe they have a last name that it sounds very Caucasian, I don't know. But you don't know who raised that person, what ties he has to that culture. For me, another thing that can give you like the right to one culture, just like I said, is love. Just like Chavela Vargas, I mentioned her in the book where a reporter on a TV show asked her, hey, Chabela, but why you keep calling yourself Mexican if you were born in Costa Rica? And she answered, because Mexicans are born whatever the fuck we want. And I think that applies not only to Mexican Americans, that applies to Costa Ricans like Chabela Vargas, like to Venezuelans and people in other countries who really love the culture, you know? Just like gender for me is a social construct where everybody should have the right to identify themselves as they please, as a human right. I believe in that. I believe the same thing with nationality. My stepdaughter is half white, half Asian, and I have raised her myself. I raised that kid, and she's more Mexican than white or Chinese because I have raised her. So there is a lot of things like adoption, marriage, but love that can give you the right to a culture. Let's let the ancestors, let's let the spirits to do their job of policing and gatekeeping and taking care of the people who's like messing around.
One of the things that Ed Calderon touched on is how important your work is, that you're preserving the Hechicera tradition. Can you share a little bit about, from what you've seen over the past years and then looking into the future, is the tradition of Hechicera, is it growing across Mexico, or are the number of practitioners changing in the United States and Mexico?
Hechiceria is just like a folk practice. You know, it's not like Brujeria de Rancho. That is a lot of practices combined in one. Hechiceria is anything, even like going to the church. In a lot of church, they have practices like putting like San Anthony, like every 13th of June, they put like the 13 like coins inside of the church. That's Hechiceria. That's not Catholicism, because that's not done in anywhere else in the world but Mexico, or at least in that way. So Hechiceria is more like common like folk knowledge, like mix a little with a little bit of mysticism. And, you know, I think it's always the same because we're always like sharing, hey, you know, this one wants to have a new boyfriend, or this one wants to get a new job. And we're always sharing Hechiceria. That's why it's just so tied to our culture. We're always having something for something else, you know, like, oh, you're sick, do this. Oh, you want to get that, do that.
I just have that image of you as a young child, you know, literally at your grandmother's knees, and family members with Rosicrucianism. And also one of the things you mentioned your early exposure to was, and you are, a tarot reader. And to that point, we have a listener question for you, Laura, from Trey Henry. And Trey is asking and saying, hi, Laura, I'm curious about the role of divination in brujeria generally, but also in your personal practice. What types or methods of divination, if any, are commonly practiced? And also, as an adjacent question, Ed Calderon talked about the use of Loteria cards in Santa Muerte practices. And I'm curious, Trey says, if you, Laura, see that in brujeria as well. Thank you.
Every bruja that I know, even in the rancho or in the city in Mexico, everybody has their own divination practice. There were a lot of brujas in los ranchos that they had like they were called like aguamancianas. They had like a fishbowl full of water, and they used to scry there. There is some people who use tarot. There is some people who use la baraja española, what we call the gypsy cards. There is a lot of people who now is using Loteria. I never saw that, at least in the part where I was born and raised. I saw Loteria cards for spell work, but not actually for divination. But now here in the United States, I'm more like exposed to other people's practices, even in Mexico, or how their grandmas were practicing, maybe in the South or in other areas. And yeah, everybody has a different ones. There is a lot of brujas who read the maíz, the corn. Other brujas who like read the fava beans, which is very common over there too. Yeah, everybody has pretty much their own system. Personally, I like the tarot, la española, and the fava beans. You know, we have so many influences that everybody, you know, use what they're more comfortable with. And, you know, it's not like, oh, everybody does this or everybody does that.
one of the things that you touch on in the book is the concept for Brujeria de Rancho called the Amare, which is involving a sympathetic magic with a meaning like a knot, a cord, or a lace. Can you tell us what is Amare, but what are some misconceptions about Amare that people have?
Well, that's another reason why I wrote the book, because I think and it can happen to me because this is my second language, right? I saw a lot of people writing books, giving classes of Mexican brujeria and just translating Amares to spell love. So for me, it was no, I mean, and I saw these Amares with P, and, I was like, okay, let me take these and give some kind of historical context, right? An Amare, yes, is a spell with the objective of tie two people romantically together. But there is a lot of sympathetic magic behind, specifically with the two principal or more important marriage ceremonies that we have had in Mexico, or what we have, which is the indigenous Mexica marriage ceremony, which is the El Amarre de la Tilma y el Huipil, the mooring of the Tilma and the Huipil, where a Mexica priest used to tie the woman Huipil and the man's Tilma together in a knot, and by that act, they were married together. When the Spaniards came and colonized Mexico, they were not able to get rid of that practice that easy. Instead, what they did is something that we call el lazo. El lazo is like a rope that, more than a rope right now, is has flowers, or there is silver or golden lazos with metal and flowers. They put it in the shoulders of the couple, and is like a knot in the middle, which is the same thing. The thing is, in the Catholic marriage ceremony, you don't see that anywhere else in the world but Mexico. I think in the 2013 or 14 now, a lot of Mexican Americans, that when they tell the priest of the Catholic Church, oh, we're Mexican, they're allowed to do that now in the United States. But if you go to another countries, you're not going to see that. It's something really Mexican. So el amarre is that tied two people romantically together, and we need laces, we need cords, we need something to tie them up. What would you do in a marriage ceremony? You will throw flowers. We adopted this custom of throwing rice too. That's what you do. There is another practices like endulzamientos, retornos, returns, sweetenings, desesperos, despairs. But all of them are different kind of workings. But I think a lot of people, we just got lost in the translation, and everything that is romantic, even if it's not with the aims of marrying, they call it here an amarre, which is not correct. One thing will be endulzamiento, retorno, dominio, desespero. There is different types of working that will fall on the romantic or the couple category, but the amarre has specific things that belongs to the culture. And I think that was something very important to preserve. So that's why I was okay, I think it's almost one page. And I talk about, what I think about this type of workings. I try to put there the context where still in 2023, divorce is very, very not accepted in certain communities in Mexico. Culturally, we still even if they're not really Catholics, there is a lot of social pushing for get a baptism for your children, married by the church, get a first communion. And I think most of Mexicans today are Catholics like that, bautismos, bodas, 15 años. You have to understand that when all these practices mix it together in the colonization, the only way that a woman will get recognition, protection, and money, power, it was through marriage. So that's how we ended up with a vast knowledge of romantic matters, how to make somebody come back, how to make this or that, good or bad, that's not my job to decide. It's just like a doctor. I don't think a doctor should tell somebody anything related to abortion, but the physical implications, not the moral ones. I think a brujo should do the same, and that's what I do. I just said, like, well, if you do an amare on somebody, it's going to work, but you may lose the opportunity to not meet or be tied to somebody who is not destined for you. You want to do this, you want to do that, because sometimes it's a matter of 3 months and, you're going to know the love of your life. And, I can be very persuasive. But in these cases, I just let them know the consequences and what could it happen if they do it. And at the end of the day, they take the decision. I don't give my clients like a moral lecture about this type of workings by any means.
That is so fascinating because it reminds me of when you go back 2,000 years to the Greco-Egyptian magical papyri. And when you see magicians and practitioners from 2,000 years ago, it's very similar. It's like, here is what a client has requested of me, and here is the spell and procedure of what I will do. Like there does exactly. It seems to be much more almost like you are a magical medical professional, almost like, okay, here's the procedure. Here's what's going on. Here's what could happen. Here's what not could happen. You just approach it very objectively.
Absolutely. And another thing that, especially young people, thinks differently. But you're coercing somebody, and somebody even said one time, a 15-year-old kid, like, this is like a date rape because you're like raping somebody magically, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, first of all, I think we're like putting two things that they're absolutely different in the same context, which is not. And the second one, I think just like abortion and the means to have a secure abortion and to have a baby in these days is a class privilege, and not to have it too. I'm so glad that you don't feel like you never in your life are going to need a man who support the 3 or 4 children that he already made to you. And you don't live in a rural community where you probably didn't finish middle school, but that's your case. That doesn't mean that is somebody else's case. That's my opinion. Yeah, a lot of people could say like, it's horrible, You're like dominating somebody monetariamente or sexually, or that's what we do. Or we're not the new age witches here. That's what we were taught, and all this practice had a historical, cultural, and very sad context in a lot of cases. So that's what I'm trying to preserve and teach people. You don't have to do it. You have better options, but if you need it, this is for you to take because it's part of what was left to us to use it to our favor.
I think, Laura, this touches on another listener question we have for you from Juanita. And Juanita is asking and saying, hi, Laura, I'm a big fan of your work and I can't wait to get a copy of your book. My question is, what is the relationship between Mexican sorcery and Santa Muerte? Does Santa Muerte play a prominent role in Mexican sorcery?
In Mexican sorcery in general, it does. But in Brujeria de Rancho, no. Not traditionally. Not traditionally is really something like really, really new. Most of these brujas de rancho, I'm talking about the ones that are 72 years old today and 80 years old. They were even afraid of La Santa Muerte. Not my case. I owe everything, like my visa, my citizenship to La Santa Muerte. But it's not something traditional to Brujeria de Rancho. That's why I didn't add it to the book, because otherwise it wouldn't be like a traditional book of Brujeria de Rancho. Plus, I think La Santa Muerte deserves her own book. You know what I'm saying? She deserves her own thing. Now it's a lot of Brujas de Rancho, like in her 40s. Well, not much, but that they work with La Santa Muerte, but it's something very recent. In the book, I think I got very clear in like the methodology. The work, if I add something about working with La Santa Muerte and Brujeria de Rancho, it wouldn't be something traditional. It will be something from me. You know what I'm saying? And I think that will be any person who writes about Santa Muerte, because I have seen that too. La Santa Muerte, you work like this or like that. And unless you're taking into consideration Doña Queta in Tepito and how she followed her devotion to La Santa Muerte, I don't think it will be traditional. But, everybody is entitled to their own opinion. Hopefully, one day we get a really, 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 really more like thick book about La Santa Muerte where it get touch all the aspects written from somebody who is from Mexico. That's what I'm waiting for.
When we think about not only everything that you've put in Brujeria de Rancho and the tradition, big picture, as people are reading your book and as they're listening to this, what are the 2 or 3 biggest misconceptions that people have either about Hechicera or Brujeria de Rancho? And then on the flip side, what are 2 or 3 big things that people should always remember or always keep in mind when they're reading your book or practicing?
Well, first, that there is no gatekeeping here. This is not a closed practice. This is a very welcoming practice. I'm not going to police anybody's doing Brujeria de Rancho. I think, the spirits do their job beautifully. Another misconception is that this will be for only like some, but no, it's actually for everybody. This was, just like I said, made out of love as a mean to empower people who was in disadvantage, who didn't have a privilege. So I hope everybody feels comfortable. I want everybody to feel invited, welcome, and that's it.
Can you also share with us, Laura, how can people follow your work? How can they get in touch with you? For instance, can you tell us about your Instagram? I love your videos and like these short snippets you put. It's so great.
It's Daphne and then _La _Hechicera. And same thing, you can find me on Twitter in the same way you can find me in TikTok. I mean, in TikTok is a way to, be fun and share and stuff like that. I don't put like my serious face over there. So don't judge me for my funny videos, but that's the social media that I have right now.
Is there anything else, Laura, that you would like to leave listeners with as we wrap up the main podcast? Anything else about your book, about the tradition, anything that you'd like to share?
For all my Mexican American community, including my children, that one day they're going to have children and great-grandchildren, and most likely they're going to be Mexican Americans. I just want to say, I know, you feel disconnected in some ways of the culture, uprooted from the place that you probably have a lot of nostalgia. But I want you to remember something that I want somebody to tell my great-grandchildren when I'm not here. Immigration is an act of love. You're here because somebody 2 generations, 3 generations, 5 generations ago loved you so much, even if they didn't know you yet, to risk their own lives for you to be here and have so many things that you were not able to have in Latin America. I know things can seem very difficult here too, and they are in a lot of different ways, but this was totally out of love and looking to give you a better future. I don't know if you met your grandmother or you didn't, but your great-grandmother or the person who emigrated in the generations back of your family, but she loved you, and that's why you're here.
Powerful, powerful words and very deep lessons that I know myself, and I'm sure the listeners can definitely take to heart. She's an author, she's a practitioner, she's a bruja, and her book from Red Wheel Weiser is Mexican Sorcery, a practical guide to Brujeria de Rancho. Laura Davila, a.k.a. Daphne La Hechicera, thank you so much just for taking the time and sharing your wisdom on the podcast today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me, guys, and hoping to come back soon.
Listeners and Glitch Bottle patrons, I hope you enjoyed that and appreciated it as much as I did. I really enjoyed how Laura breaks the misconceptions of Mexican sorcery, what it's all about, as well as dismantling this concept of gatekeeping and talking about the similarities within the Solomonic tradition as well, and also the differences between practitioners in Mexico versus in the United States. Definitely make sure to check out the links below to support Laura and get a copy of her book. Also, wow, amazing questions as usual from the best podcast supporters on the planet. Of course, they're better known as Glitch Bottle patrons on patreon.com/glitchbottle. If you'd like to hop on the Glitch Bottle caravan with exclusive perks and also ask guest questions, I definitely hope to see you over on patreon.com as well. As always, this is Alexander Eth reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.